thank you for joining us today for our panel on sustainability. I hope to cover sustainability in its many forms, from climate to governance to all other aspects. But I have with me a fantastic panel who are going to cover all of these. We're looking at a very interesting world at the moment. I think many people have in their minds 2050 as a key target, as a key date for targets. But I think in actual fact, we're looking at 2023 being a real year of reckoning and a year for many industries to reassess what their strategies are for both decarbonization and then the wider impact of decarbonization. Crypto assets are no different, and we'll have to come up with a really quite sparkling strategy in order to impress everyone, which I have full trust that they will do. So I'd like to introduce my panel. Brett McDowell from Hedera Hashgraph, if I could ask you to introduce yourself and your company.
Sure. So I am the chairman of Hedera Hashgraph, or the Hedera Governing Council. We are a layer 1 blockchain project. The Hedera network is a layer 1 blockchain project built on the technology known as Hashgraph, something that was invented, and then the Hedera network was built on it. Works a little differently. So one of my colleagues is going to go into a little more detail on how that works. But I want to, as a panel, we want to leave you with information that maybe you didn't have when you came in here today. A lot of that's going to be specific to the different projects the three of us work on, but some of it is hopefully generally relevant. And one of the things I think is generally relevant is that whenever you look at a distributed ledger technology, always ask yourself, how is it governed? Not just how the technology works or what use cases are being built on it or how much is being invested. Ask yourself, who's in charge? Governance really means control. Who's in control? And the promise of decentralization and what we can prove in terms of decentralized governance is the key to making progress with regulation and public policy. So the Hedera Governing Council governs this blockchain differently than other projects generally do. We're comprised of up to 39 companies. So we're owned and operated by a collection of well-known, typically Fortune 500 companies, also some universities. Currently there are 26 companies. There are regulated banks that are part of this council, big tech companies like Google and IBM and LG, and a diverse array of other companies looking to use the blockchain. So my role here is governance. My interest in blockchain is governance, and hopefully we can talk more about how governance plays a role in being green and secure.
Thank you, Brett, and we'll definitely be coming back to governance meeting sustainability. Wes Geisenberger, can I ask you to explain the HBAR Foundation?
Yeah, absolutely. So the HBAR Foundation is an organization focused on growing the Hedera ecosystem, and it's comprised of 4 key funds across the crypto economy, traditional fintech, the metaverse, and then the Sustainable Impact Fund, which I lead, which is a $100 million fund focused on growing sustainability projects that are not just focused on the lower layers of the crypto stack and focused on our footprint, but it's actually focused on creating fully auditable projects, these projects that measure emissions, that better measure how we create things like offsets or renewable energy credits, or even help facilitate exchange. And we're investing in a lot of projects across the ecosystem that follow IWA and GBBC standards, coming from the token taxonomy framework. And we're really focused on growing the economy in any of these 4 funds, but also doing it in a standards-based way. And as part of that, we think about security not just from the lower level of consensus, but also making sure that the assets that we're creating in the sustainability economy are secure, they're easily understood, and that they help form a ecologically aware world, which means they're following the standards that exist in the Web 2 world today, but also they're consistent as we transition these parts of the economy into the Web 3 world.
Thank you so much. Kamal, Youssefi, can you talk to us about the Hashgraph Association and perhaps the relationship between all 3 of you a little bit?
Definitely. I am the president of the board of the Hedera Hashgraph, or the Hashgraph Association. The Hashgraph Association is an independent and non-profit organization which has been established to enable the build-up of an innovative ecosystem for digital transformation initiatives that leverage Hedera Hashgraph capabilities. So we established the Hashgraph Association with the mission to empower entrepreneurs, support innovators, enable enterprises and governmental institutions to enter and compete in the digital asset space and enter the digital transformation through blockchain while addressing the key elements to enable this transition, which is education, innovation, and sustainability.
Well, Kamal, I'm actually going to start with you, and we're going to talk about, I think, sometimes the elephant in the room, of course, not to us who are really focused on this, but before we have a conversation about how blockchain and DLT can really support sustainable development, we need to have our house in order. So how can crypto be green and how can it be secure? What are the trade-offs we're talking about, and how do you see innovation moving this challenge along?
Yeah, it's a very good question. That's a good question to start with. I mean, the crypto industry is growing very fast, and the concerns around the environmental impact are growing even faster. And the main reason behind it is the energy consumption. If we take the popular cryptocurrency, which is Bitcoin, as an example, it's energy intensive by design. It's mined by millions of high-end performing machines and computers from all around the globe. And this fact makes us think about the mining as a process in itself, and the underlying, or let's say the implemented consensus mechanism of these consensus protocols or consensus mechanisms. So there is kind of huge or growing concerns in terms of energy consumptions, in terms of the immense amount of computational power needed to validate these transactions. But for sure, this depends on the different protocols and the different categories of consensus mechanisms that we are using. In this context, or in the context of crypto industry and blockchain in general, proof of work and proof of stake are two of the most prevalent consensus mechanisms that we have in our industry. And as you know, a consensus mechanism relies on various methodologies and algorithms to reach consensus and to maintain trust, and most importantly, ensure security within a decentralized network. Having all these components together brings kind of a need of I mean, don't get me wrong, proof of work is a proven and a solid consensus mechanism. It kind of enables crypto transactions to be processed in a decentralized, peer-to-peer and in a secure manner. But if you consider the amount of the energy needed to verify, process, and validate a transaction, it's huge. And that's made the cryptocurrency world and the crypto industry to think of alternatives or improved solutions that would lead us to the proof of stake. Proof of stake doesn't require that immense amount of energy and computational power that a proof of work needs to validate and process transactions, because the coins are simply locked in a smart contract on the chain. For sure, it solves the performance issue, but it brings another challenge that needs to be solved, which is the governance and also the control over the network. Those kind of challenges, that's something that we have been looking at, we have been working at Hedera Hashgraph. And Hedera Hashgraph managed to solve these problems by designing and developing the Hashgraph consensus, which basically combines both decentralization and governance. It implements a distributed consensus, and ensures security.
And can I play devil's advocate just a little bit there? Because there are these security concerns. No doubt there will be innovation in that. There will be progress, yes, and then further capabilities, further applications of those capabilities. Is there room still, though, to decarbonize proof of work, to use it to finance new renewables, yeah, to acknowledge that there's demand for proof of work, and it's not just because Bitcoin has, yes, been for a while the most popular cryptocurrency, but many people still at this stage trust proof of work over others. And how do you see that moving going forward?
Yeah, I mean, definitely it's possible. It's doable. In my view, the path to greener crypto industry, or let's say green proof of work, this requires major changes in the system at different levels.
Yeah.
First of all, it starts with education and raising awareness. So what I mean by that is calibrating the right mindset. It includes developing crypto frameworks and deploying international standards. How are we approaching the crypto industry in general? It includes also looking for alternative sources for energy. And what I mean by that, non-carbon sources like hydro, wind, and solar power.
Well, then this brings me very nicely onto Wes, because I'm going to say beyond carbon, not beyond climate, because what we've just highlighted there is, for example, hydro. There are other knock-on effects. And there's a wider question around sustainability that really needs to be addressed in many different forms. What is your company, HBAR Foundation, doing to address that?
Yeah, so the HBAR Foundation, we're really focused on that layer up, the utility built on top of Hedera. And what we're focused on is building the sustainability economy. And so we make investments at a few different levels, and things like open source infrastructure. So we talked earlier today about the Guardian, which is an open source framework to tokenize things like carbon emissions, to have full auditability of the methodology of how they're tokenized, the policies that they follow, maybe it's GHG protocol as an example, understand the roles that sit in that process, have actors with identifiers or decentralized identifiers fulfilling that role who are credentialed and have the credentials to measure and certify certain pieces of information to get to quantitative outcomes, like scope 1, 2, or 3 emissions for a specific project site from a factory, or rolling that up to a company level or a country level for GHG inventories. We do that on the flip side of the market when we measure things like offsets, renewable energy credits. So for example, if you wanted to prove that your Bitcoin was decarbonized, you would probably want to actually prove that using a public ledger to make sure that that's fully transparent. You could prove it down to the nth degree. But we also work on infrastructure that is focused on exchanging those types of assets, because when you can't reduce or mitigate, you need to be able to go seek out different ways to achieve net zero goals. And so actually today we're happy to announce that we've made our open source investment in something called an automated regression market maker and an automated regression market broker. And this concept allows you to trade non-fungible assets, so you can track down to the metric ton, you can track to even the sub-metric ton, and still maintain the auditability, that auditable link, following the TTF and the IWA standards to every single role and actor, following the methodology. And what that means is, previously we commoditized things like carbon credits. We said everything's a metric ton, it's all pretty much equal except the price is different. You have to go investigate to these projects. Now, what you can start doing is you can look at all the data behind every single metric ton. You can look at every single emission and say, well, did they take the steps to mitigate? Did they take the steps to reduce? And now we can actually start to settle these transactions, whether they're traded emissions or whether they're offsets that folks are trying to sell in the voluntary or compliance market. And we can use smart contracts powered by machine learning models to better seek out, is this credit additional? Is it durable? Does it have any leakage? What vintage is it from? And we can look at this as metadata that's fully auditable. And what we're investing in the HBAR Foundation is open source projects or implementations of projects like that. And we're very excited to be building an open ecosystem that's built on new ways to tokenize credits, new ways to exchange those credits, new ways to manage those identities and credits tied to them, better ways to visualize it. And we're investing up the stack to applications, implementing that, and large-scale implementations that change how supply chains work. And so that's really what we're focused on at the foundation.
And I think that auditability and transparency credentials that we could look at blockchain and say, okay, it naturally lends itself to being pretty good in the G area of ESG. However, as we saw in the previous panel, we talked about it's just a technology. It can be used either way, and we've got to be making sure that happens. So, Brett, tell us about the council and how are you supporting governance across the network? And if I may also, how do we support governance standards across the community in general and the industry?
Okay, so in terms of governance, one of the things that's key is, again, who's in control and how are they asserting that control? Because when you build a decentralized network, the whole value proposition is that you're not interacting with in a Web 2 world. It's not another company that's your counterparty on those transactions. You're interacting with public infrastructure. And so who is keeping that public infrastructure running? How is the economy being driven? These are all decisions that you make in the governance piece. So the council members, they have kind of a taxonomy around how we approach governance. So network governance are the decisions that affect the network itself. What are the fees for the API calls on the network? That's one decision. What's the software? What's going to go into the next release of the software? That's another decision. And what are the requirements for node operators? What's kind of the certification requirements for running a node, performance requirements or other compliance requirements on node operations? Then we have different components of that. So operational governance is really for node operations. We also have deliberative governance. This is your standard human beings collaborating to make decisions. So parliamentary procedure and having all of that very well documented and publicly available for review. For example, we publish all the minutes of our council meetings and the decisions they make. And then you have cryptographic governance. This is where those in control are actually asserting their control cryptographically by signing certain transactions, such as updating the software, such as adding a new node operator to the address book of node operators. This is done with hardware wallets and private keys that Google and Boeing and IBM and others, they have those keys, they sign those transactions, and that's how it happens on the network. So proving with strong cryptographic governance the way it's distributed and keeping those transactions live in front of everyone. So this is not how traditional software business is operated. This is what's different in the distributed world than the Web 2 world, the Web 3 world versus the Web 2 world. And then the last piece is, of course, corporate governance. So to the extent that human beings are still involved in coordinating the efforts of other human beings, then you leverage traditional corporate governance oversight. So we do have an elected board of directors, and they're responsible for the traditional corporate governance role as a board of directors over any of the officers or executives that might be involved in the tasks that they are delegated, which we limit to the greatest extent possible. So those are the pieces, and I think that's a replicable model across other projects. It's sort of been easily consumed by my council members as I've taken them through that, and it's pretty consistent. So I think it would apply regardless of the technology of a given DLT.
And I think that easy to use element is very interesting. So I want to come back to your standards in a second. But before I do, on governance, we talk a lot about the sustainable funding of a protocol or a project, and then the sustainable participation. Because if we're going to be community-led, how do we ensure that we have a solid and long-term active participation in these decisions, whether that's through a council, through a decentralized autonomous organization? What is your approach to that, and how do we, again, replicate that across the industry?
Yes, so everyone kind of understands that your token economics model for whatever ledger that you're working with is very important to the sustainability of that ledger. So people, sort of a well-trotted ground. But when you're talking about pulling together a group of validator node operators, what are the incentives for them? And so you have to use game theory there as well. So for example, our council, they are legal owners and operators of the company. It is actually legally a Delaware LLC. It operates in a nonprofit manner, and each member of the LLC is those companies that I mentioned before. They're members of the LLC. So they have legal authority, and that's what we want. We want them to have total control of those key decisions. However, the LLC agreement is very customizable. Most DAOs are actually Delaware LLCs at this point. And so in that LLC agreement, they're limited. They have no profit incentive. So that was by design, because we didn't want those in control of the network to just sort of, take funds out of the treasury for themselves, for example, or crank up the fees really high on the network and take profit off the top. So you have to think about those incentives. Now, there is a treasury with every one of these cryptocurrency projects. So the issuer is essentially the central bank of that ledger's economy. Our coin is called the HBAR. And they are responsible to decide how to best use that treasury. So one of the things that they have decided to make some treasury available for is to fund use cases. And one of the use cases that every single one of those companies from all around the world that sits on our council has is, net zero carbon footprint. So they all have those commitments, and one of the things that we have is an innovation sandbox that they have decided to make available for themselves to get some funding and technical support to immediately start working on applications using the capabilities that Wes was talking about, that he's really kind of leading and driving in the HBAR Foundation. And last but not least, these companies want to join this council because this is all greenfield territory, and they want to work with their peers. They want to have that conversation with those other big companies also trying to figure out blockchain and cryptocurrency for the first time. And they also want to work in aggregate to help accelerate or sort out the legal and regulatory barriers, because that continues to be the #1 barrier to adoption in mainstream, Fortune 500 enterprise use of public DLT.
That's a great answer. Thank you very much. And Wes, to come back to your best practices and standards and development of really, really interesting taxonomies. It's great to have these, and the industry is clearly driven towards collaborating on this. But what takes a best practice framework or a framework for scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions from an existing framework to meaningfully implemented, and we're seeing change on a governance perspective, from a social perspective, and from an environmental perspective?
Yeah, so there's a lot there, but maybe just focusing in on the emissions. We have to take some of the existing standards today, because that's how companies are reporting. They report based on their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions using GHG protocol generally as an accepted accounting principle. There's others as well, depending on the geography they're in, depending on if there's an industry type of reporting metric. But they all start with the same basic principles. And the first thing we need to do most times is digitize that reporting. As part of that, we have the opportunity where many of these companies are jumping not just from paper-based to DLT, but they have to go through the digital process as well. And so oftentimes what it gives us the opportunity to do is basically explain the way it's been done today for some of the companies that have gone ahead and digitized, explain the benefits of DLT, and it becomes very transparent that if you want to have trusted data and you're a large multinational corporation, you need to have an identity of every single data provider, whether it's within your company, from a counterparty organization, maybe it's an investment you have in part of your portfolio, and you need to be able to start applying identities to trust whether this data is true, whether it's granular, whether it's accurate. And so when we work with partners, one really good example from the Governing Council is Avery Dennison. Now, many folks know Avery Dennison is that triangle logo in the back of their shirt, but they're also the world's largest RFID manufacturer. And so what Avery Dennison has done is they've created a startup within the company called Atma.io. And their goal was to apply a digital identity to every single product that they touch with a unique fingerprint. And what they've started to do, and they announced actually a couple weeks ago, is that they're going to do that using the Guardian, our open source framework for tokenizing these assets like carbon emissions. And of course, they work with massive supply chains. So you think of the largest supply chains in the world, like companies like Adidas, or companies that are much smaller than that maybe are just producing raw materials or any type of agricultural product. And they need to be able to track that from the point of growth through harvest, through sale, at their point of sale with a grocery store they're working with. And what they're doing differently than maybe what you've heard from in the past, whether it's something like a food trust, is they're using things like W3C specifications of DIDs. So identity standards combined with things like the TTF for token standards, so we know the behaviors, how they work on it at technology level. But of course, they also need to follow that industry level process. And so what we've done with the Guardian is we've created a policy workflow engine, just like you would in a digital tool set. And we make that open and available so everyone can understand those roles, actors, and data, so that you can better say, well, this is what a Scope 1 emission looks like for this site, or a Scope 2 emission, or a Scope 3 emission as part of that process. And they can actually defensively show that on behalf of the corporation with every single identity, every single device, providing trusted data along the way.
And it's these live examples that we're talking about that are going to push this from, oh, all cryptocurrency is just terrible for the environment, and also, by the way, all social concerns too, through to actually there are nuances here and there's some extraordinary innovation really helping some real life challenges.
And the thing is, we're not just doing this at a POC level. As part of the announcement for something like ATMA, is they're saying this isn't just one small supply chain. This is billions of transactions that they're putting forth this year. I don't know of another DLT use case that's operating at the billions of transactions of scale, period. But within a single year, tens of billions of transactions is the type of scale that actually proves utility in the market, that proves that every single data point behind these tokens with identities is real, it's tangible, and you can measure the impact.
It's very cool. And on that note of engagement and more live examples, Kamal, you talked about education being a really key part. What do you think about the best way to engage with stakeholders, policymakers, regulators on the climate impact of cryptocurrencies as a whole?
So, in our approach, we combine a pragmatic, or we follow a pragmatic approach. So we try to combine or link all the different stakeholders together, be it policymakers, enterprises, startups, entrepreneurs. We unify our forces, try to identify viable use cases for blockchain industry. For sure, the technology is only one component of or one variable of the equation, but you still need to find viable use cases to be implemented and deployed on the network. The education starts at the beginning, or brings value at the beginning in terms of educate, train, certify, get all the different stakeholders to speak one language, to understand each other, because it's not that easy to get policymaker understand what a developer is talking about, or what an enterprise from commercial perspective is thinking about. And there where we think our learning programs and our executive programs that we designed for different industries are going to contribute and bring all these parties and stakeholders to work together.
Yeah, well, I think this will give a lot to pushing these conversations forward, raising that level of public discourse, and through these standards, through the council, through these governance standards, implementing best practice across the sector.
And we work also with a lot of academia, universities, to link, let's say, the next generation with enterprises, corporates, and let's say startups that are already dealing in the space, with one goal is to let's say speed the transition from the concept and idea to the implementation. And that's what the Hashgraph Association is behind.
Fantastic. I'm going to open up to questions because I know we've got just a couple more minutes, very short. But Brett, was there something you wanted to add to that?
I just wanted to make sure that we answered the panel's question around security. So I think we talked a little bit about going green. So a quick recap, proof of work, first generation DLT technology, very energy consumptive. Bitcoin, second generation technology, kind of like Ethereum, adding programmability to the platform. Proof of work at first, moving to proof of stake. Third generation, and there are lots of technologies out there, not just Hedera, that would go into this camp. Very fast, high scalability, far less expensive per transaction, which we didn't even hit on, but that's critical. So they're almost all of them are proof of stake systems. So you really don't see innovation launched at proof of work, and it's really not because of the green concern. It's because of speed. proof of stake came out as a leading candidate to build these technologies around because it's so much faster and also less expensive. So it really was the way to scale some of these applications. It might be more than the digital gold use case. When you talk about security of these networks, you're really saying, how does the algorithm protect and the economy and the governance, how does that work together to protect the consolidation of influence, to prevent the consolidation of influence? They're distributed networks. All of these networks fail when a certain percentage of those in control when one actor has that much control. It's typically a third of the network. So if you can control a third of all of the consensus algorithm voting, you can basically either block or corrupt outcomes of a network. So proof of work is designed, when you talk about security, yes, it's very secure in that how the problems are solved, and it's proven because it's been out there for more years. But you also see consolidation, and almost by design it has to consolidate because of the economies of scale on the cost of running a mining rig. So that's why you see mining kind of consolidate. So really the only path there is renewable energy to really be clean and secure with proof of work. Whereas in proof of stake, the concern might be, well, what if someone is quietly aggregating all of this influence? They're quietly aggregating over a third of all the circulating stake. And that is why you have to be very careful about your model. And at Hedera, we have not yet decided that it is cost prohibitive to launch such an attack against our network. And that's why we're still permissioned. So only our council members can run nodes right now. When it is cost prohibitive to aggregate over a third of stake, then we will be permissionless and have, anyone could run a node. And that's how, aggregation of influence happens. And so that's kind of your path to being green and secure between those two systems.
It's a real balance because, as you say, we're all focused on the climate emergency, and decarbonization is #1 thing to focus on. And also that must not be at the expense of strong governance, being aware of biodiversity, gender diversity, racial diversity, etc. So how do we consider all these moving forward? I'm afraid we've gone too far over, but it leaves me to thank our wonderful panelists, and thank you very much to the audience for taking part in this panel.